I have my screen open, so let me know when it shows on yours.
Okay. You have a little box that popped up. There we go. Perfect.
Okay.
All right. And with that, here is Erin Sheldon.
Hello. All right, so my name's Erin. I'm the mother of an 11-year-old with Angelman named Maggie, and you will hear a bit of her story here. In the last few months, I've just had an unusual number of people asking for tips to better include their children in the inclusive classroom, also from teachers asking for more strategies to support kids in the inclusive classroom. So we actually, this is the second time we started this webinar. The first time there were some technical difficulties, and I had intended it to be about literacy instruction in the inclusive classroom, but just found that we needed to first talk about inclusion, so that's why we've separated this into two pieces. So the one that will immediately follow this one is looking more at what the literacy instruction looks like in a general education classroom. So here's Maggie. She's kind of a classic one of our kids with Angelman. She doesn't have any words, but she, for 2 years now, has been beginning to use the communication system Proloquo, and we will talk more about communication support in the next webinar after this on the one that's being recorded tomorrow on communication in the inclusive classroom. But that's my girl. That's the picture in the top right corner is Maggie's first duck face selfie. So obviously being with her typical peers has had even an effect on the kinds of selfies that she takes. I will not be asking this webinar if students with Angelman can be included in regular classrooms. They simply can be. It's very much a matter of problem solving. So what we'll be asking is how can our students with Angelman be included in regular classrooms, because really the first rule of inclusion is that we don't ask if, we don't ask whether students can be included, we simply ask how, because inclusion is very much a philosophy and a belief system that we are all in a community together, that the classroom community should reflect the broader social community around the school, and therefore just as we don't ask, you know, can students with Angelman syndrome be part of their communities, be part of the United States, be part of Canada? We simply don't. They're simply citizens. We simply ask how can we support them to be full contributing citizens. We're going to do the same thing in our inclusive classrooms. But I think what that really begs is the bigger question is how can the general curriculum meet the needs of our students with Angelman, because this is obviously where it gets tricky. I've been in many, many classrooms with our students with Angelman, and there's often, you know, parents really pushing for inclusion and feeling that the school is not as supportive. And when I go in and talk to the school team, it is so rare that the teachers actually oppose the inclusion of our student with Angelman. It's much, much, much more common that the teachers say, we want to include this child, we just don't know how to teach them. And I have met so many teachers who just want more support, knowing how can I be sure the child isn't just present in the classroom, but is actually learning. So I'm hoping that this webinar will provide some support and strategies for that. And to me, the really big question is to go one step further and say, how can our students with Angelman actually contribute to the learning that happens in their general education classrooms? And I know that on the face of it can sound like a lofty goal, but I think it's very possible, and we'll talk about how. We know from research funded by the ASF in the past that parents of students with Angelman have many goals for their children's education. Communication skills generally are ranked first. There was a survey in 2011 where communication skills, independence, such as motor skills like independent walking, and friendship development and relationships, sort of fostering our children's ability to really interact socially with other people, were the main priorities that parents expressed. And interestingly to me, because I'm actually someone who really focuses on literacy instruction was not a high goal. But when we talk more about literacy in the inclusive classroom, you'll actually see how literacy, if we understand it very broadly, supports all of these. From my perspective, and I think this is consistent with what I've heard from just parents all over North America, Europe, everywhere, is that our students with Angelman syndrome, what we really need for them to develop over the whole course of their school career is expressive communication skills that are sufficient to meet their daily communication needs. We want them to be able to function communicatively. We want them to be able to get their needs met, including their needs for social interaction, their needs for learning new information, their needs for having friendly conversations, and much more personal, intimate relationships. So there's just so much that we all communicate every day, and we want to make sure our children with Angelman can communicate that whole broad range of all the communication needs that we all have. We want to make sure that our children have enough receptive understanding that they can really relate to other people, that they can form close friendships and relationships with the people of their lives. And so it's not just about helping them learn how to communicate, but really be able to empathize and understand the stories of others so they can share their story as well. We want our children to be autonomous, to have as much control over their own bodies as they can, including the abilities to self-regulate their own bodies and their own behavior so that they can be out in the world and all the places that all of the rest of us are and can be welcomed and contributing there rather than perceived as having challenging behaviors. And I think what we all really, really dream of and sometimes are even afraid to hope for is that by the time our children are adults, they will have found how they contribute to the lives and society around them, some unique way that the world is better because they are in it, some unique way that wherever they go is better because they are part of it. I think we all feel that as parents. We all feel that our children are contributing, but so often the message we get back from the broader society is that our kids are more of a burden or more of a challenge than contributing members. And so I think that a huge reason why I'm such a big proponent of inclusive education is that if we do it right, part of what we're doing is making sure that we're really paying attention to the contribution that our kids with Angelman are making. So these are universal needs. This is Maslow's hierarchy. This is a kind of spoof of it off of Facebook, but it kind of remains the same. But these are the universal needs that all people have. And so as we think about what our goals are for students with Angelman, we can see that they're very consistent with what Maslow described as the universal needs of all people, that at a very basic level, besides needing Wi-Fi, we all need food, water, shelter, and warmth. And so when we think about our goals for students with Angelman, it's kind of being able to meet those basic needs of expressing that they're hungry, that they're cold, that they're lonely, that they want company, but just something to keep them, make sure that they're physically safe, make sure that they have the communication skills to not be taken advantage of in terms of their own personal safety, and to really know that they can express any concerns they have so that we can keep them safe. We want them to feel a sense of belonging and love from their friends, from their families, even intimate partners, which I know is a controversial topic that has been raised recently in the Angelman community. We really want our kids to feel that sense of achievement and recognition that we want all students to feel. We want our kids to learn how they are smart, to be proud of all their own accomplishments, and ideally to develop their own internal creativity, their own internal skills, so that they really have, you know, a skill, something as adults that they are sharing with the rest of the world that just gives them a lot of fulfillment. And when I talk to parents, I think our biggest fear is that our kids could end up in an adult life where they've simply been warehoused somewhere or babysat, but just don't really have that opportunity to be kind of creatively fulfilling themselves and really interacting socially. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion. And like I said, those are all universal needs. If you take that slide of what it is our students with Angelman need to develop, we can say the same for all of their typical siblings, all of the classmates in their general education classroom, that all people need to develop expressive communication sufficient to meet their daily communication needs. all of us need to develop the skills to be able to communicate on the job and in the community and with the people we care about, and to be able to regulate our own bodies and behaviors so that we can be successful, and ideally that we find our own contribution that we make to society. So I just wanted to put it in that context. As we're working on all of these communication skills with our students with Angelman, I know you guys see the slide in my presentations a lot, but it's because it's so brilliant. What we're talking about here is whenever we're talking about communication, we're developing all of these different ways that we communicate. We're learning how to listen while also learning how to talk or use an AAC system. Learning how to listen is actually directly related to learning how to read, because it's learning how to understand the story of someone else and be able to relate to it and interact with it. And when we're learning how to communicate expressively, we're actually also learning broadly the concept of writing, because writing is really about taking the ideas that are in our own head and sharing them with other people. And you can look at the general education curriculum in any developed country, and when it comes down to it, this is really what we're working on for all students, just that ability to be able to maximize all these areas. Whenever people talk about developing functional skills or functional literacy, what I would argue, and that the work of all of these scholars listed here on this slide would follow or would support, is that the most effective way to support functional skill development is often literacy. When we are working on literacy, we're also working on communication, we're working on social skills, we're working on social interaction, we're working on independence. And the general education classroom is usually the place where we have the most natural opportunities to do all of that in a way that best reflects kind of natural life. We have a trend in the Angelman community towards increased inclusion in regular classrooms. And I actually give Colin Farrell a lot of credit for this, because a number of years ago, he came out publicly supporting a student who was in some kind of inclusive education struggle, and talked about his commitment to his own son's school inclusion. And what I remember from that time period was that before he started talking about it, there were all these conversations in Angelman forums and in our listservs about can a student with Angelman be included? Which students with Angelman can be included? You know, how high functioning do you have to be as a student with Angelman to be fully included? And to me, I date it back to a few years ago when Colin started talking like that the conversation shifted to how do I get more inclusion for my child with Angelman? How do I get the best inclusion? How do I get actually get authentic inclusion rather than just presence in the classroom? This is data just from an informal survey I did of 700 Angelman families, and according to those family reports, about 10% of our students with Angelman are fully included all day long in regular classrooms, and about half of our kids, an additional 50%, spend some part of the day in regular classrooms. It might be for specials, it might be half a day, it might be, there's a whole variety of configurations that people have, but this tells us that the majority of students with Angelman, those school teams are dealing with these questions of how we provide the best inclusive education. When I talk to families about what their goals are for having their child included, friendships is absolutely the #1 thing. I think there is a dream, one of the strongest dreams that our families have is that our kids can have friendships with their peers, friendships with their neighbors, friendships with that just kind of ordinary life with people who like you, so that by adulthood they have the same kind of opportunities for recreation and just hanging out with the people you like that all the rest of us hopefully have. Definitely families who are advocating for school inclusion want a challenging, stimulating curriculum. They've looked at the research and they know that it supports the idea that there's often greater challenge and higher expectations for learning in a general education classroom. Now, that very very much depends, but that's usually the case. They're looking for really strong positive role models. They know that our students with Angelman tend to be very focused on their peers, tend to be constantly looking at the people around them for their models of behavior, and so they just want to make sure that their classmates are the best possible models of strong and effective communication skills and really strong self-regulated behavior. And they're looking for a chance for their children to just be familiar to other people so that their child can really have that sense of belonging in the community, so that you know, for all of us who have experienced what it's like when our child is being stared at in public, when just walking up to people, when you see the way that their body language can change, that's what happens when our children are not familiar and when disability is not familiar. And we just all so badly, I think, want to create that sense of familiarity. And that's often, for some families, that's their number one goal for school inclusion, is just that their child will be very familiar and therefore not feared. We know that school inclusion is associated with positive long-term outcomes, particularly basically just with opportunity, that students who have been included throughout their school career are more likely to have friendships with people who do not have disabilities. So it just broadens their circle of kind of potential friends. I mean, obviously, all of us are not friends with everyone we ever went to school with. We tend to select a few, but we want the largest possible pool from which to find those possible future friends. And often the inclusive classroom kind of provides the largest possible pool to find those kindred spirits who are going to be our friendships over time. We know that your chances for being employed as an adult are much higher if you were included in a regular school. When you think about it, that really makes sense, because the students who are in the regular inclusive classroom are also future employers, they're future co-workers, they're future supervisors. For someone who has been a peer to a student with disabilities, who one day is in a hiring position, if they're approached to support a supported employment position, if they know what it is, if they know that we can support people with disabilities to participate in a regular classroom, we know that they're much more likely to say, yes, I would consider supporting someone to participate in the workplace. So it just creates the kind of social networking and social capital and familiarity that leads to employment. We have students with Angelman taking post-secondary courses, and we know that that's all of those students, the only ones I know about who are doing that, had an inclusive education. We know that it increases your opportunities for housing, particularly housing with other young people your same age without disability. If you ask any of Maggie's friends, she's got 3 friends who have been swearing and arguing for years that they are all intending to live with her as an adult. And within our Angelman community, we have many examples of children with Angelman who were included throughout school who are now living with as roommates with the people that they went to school with some of the kids, the peers they went to school with. And we know it increases your opportunities just for kind of normal recreation in the community. As someone who focuses on literacy, I support school inclusion because we know from the research that the general education classroom provides the most opportunities for what we call really comprehensive literacy instruction, which we'll talk about more in the next seminar. We know that, I mean, what I would say is that the inclusive classroom is like a garden bed, and that it creates opportunities for friendship, for belonging, for participation in your natural society. That doesn't mean that it actually happens, but it creates opportunity. Those opportunities have to be fostered. So just like when we plant a flower seed, it has to be watered, it has to be nurtured, it has to be fertilized, it has to receive sunlight for it to grow. The inclusive classroom provides that same opportunity, but also needs to be nurtured. All that said, being included does not guarantee that the student can access the instruction or will actually participate. And all of us who have worked to support students in general education classrooms know that when done poorly, students who are supposedly included are often in the corner of the classroom doing something completely separate from what everyone else is doing, working on tasks that are unrecognizable in terms of the general education curriculum and actually having minimal interaction with peers. So simply getting that placement or being in the classroom doesn't actually guarantee all the opportunities that we're hoping it does. So this is my daughter Maggie. She has been included basically all the way through. When she was very young, she was in a Montessori daycare center and then a regular preschool, a regular nursery school. Here in Ontario, there's actually a funding stream so that rather than putting kids in developmental preschools when they hit age 3, any child with a disability can go to any daycare center, any preschool, any nursery school, any summer camp that the family selects, and the government actually funds the support person for that child to participate. So Maggie has taken advantage of that. She's been in regular preschool, summer classes, all that kind of thing, and then she started public school at age 4, which is the norm here in Ontario, with the same students that she's now in class with in grade 6. But I ended up going back to school, getting my graduate degree in education with the question of how to improve Maggie's school inclusion because, everything looked pretty good in the early years, but really by the end of about 2nd grade, it just seemed like her program was completely separate from that of her peers, that there were these rich moments where she was really interacting, but it just seemed that her instruction was very surface level. So, for example, while the kids were studying Pioneer Society, Maggie was matching photos of log cabins, and she just did not seem like she was staying engaged. It just did not seem that this was really meaningful instruction to her. And in fact, by the end of about grade 2, it just seemed like her friendships were really struggling. She wasn't getting quite as many birthday party invitations. She didn't have as many girls asking for play dates. When she was a bit younger, she had played over at other kids' houses and was getting those kinds of invitations. And so I decided I needed to talk to the kids and kind of find out what was going on. These are comments made by Maggie's classmates around grade 4 or at the end of grade 3. So here were the things that the peers said. This is not the adult perspective. This is not what the teachers were saying, but what her classmates were saying when I went to them and said, what is going on? Why does it seem that Maggie's inclusion is faltering? One example they said was that they didn't feel the staff knew how to handle her, and that the emphasis was really on how to handle her rather than how to teach her. There were several comments along the lines of they're afraid of Maggie. They're afraid of what's going to happen. They're afraid of what she's going to do. Like if she touched things, that what the kids were picking up on was this kind of overall anxiety on behalf of the staff who support her. And I've seen this in many of our classrooms where maybe kids struggle with self-regulation and impulse control around things like pulling hair, and the staff then are always very anxious that if the child gets near any other kids, they're going to pull hair, and they kind of accidentally put off this sense of anxiety that the children definitely pick up on. The impression from Maggie's classmates, now again, these were just grade 3 students, grade 4 students, was that the staff were always so busy taking care of Maggie that they didn't really have time to teach her, that there wasn't really time for Maggie to learn. And I just found myself asking, well, what is she learning then? If her whole focus is taking care of her in the classroom, is she learning how she is smart? Is she learning to participate? Is she learning to contribute? Is she learning that her only job is to simply reduce her burden on other people, to develop more independent skills so that, she could do things like dress herself and toilet herself independently? But was she learning that that was the only expectation? And what were her classmates learning about her, given what you just heard that they were noticing? Were they learning that she's an authentic fellow student? Were they learning that she's a potential friend? Or were they learning that we kind of include people like that because it's the right thing to do, but then we have to do something completely separate? And it was really interesting to me. When Maggie was in grade 4, we had started a writing program for her. This is actually her first writing that any of us could look at and actually understood what she was trying to scribble about. Maggie still likes to study the civil rights leader Rosa Parks, and the fact that she learned about Rosa Parks during Black History Month really shows me that that's why she's included, right? I mean, so many classrooms, so many separate classrooms would not have covered Black History Month as a topic, period. But the fact that Maggie really seemed to relate to Rosa Parks, the fact that she found that story so compelling. Rosa Parks was the young African-American girl who was the first to integrate an all-white school in the Deep South, kind of at the height of the Black Civil Rights Movement. She had to be escorted to school every day by National Guard soldiers. And the white community so rejected her membership in the school that all the white families boycotted the school. And for a year, Rosa Parks was the only student who attended this school. There was one teacher, one student, because the entire community was hoping that her inclusion would fail. And the facts that Maggie wrote about that, Maggie's teacher made her little video asking her if she was writing about Ruby. You can see all these R's and E's, and Maggie was just so excited that someone actually understood what she was trying to write. Now, Maggie's obviously a very emergent writer, but her reaction to this just really was powerful. And that just, again, made me ask, well, on the one hand, I'm so glad that she's in a classroom with this challenging general education curriculum, but what is she learning about herself if the story that she most identifies with is a girl who is a pioneer in inclusion? And in many ways, Maggie's a pioneer in inclusion because she certainly has the most significant disabilities of any student in her school. We looked for support for Maggie's inclusion. I was studying inclusive practices in graduate school, and we reached out to Helen, Sanderson and Associates. We developed these person-centered reviews, we did a person-centered review process to really ask what was working about Maggie's education, what was not working, what were the problems that we needed to solve, how to really focus on all of her strengths while we also figured out how to best support her. So this is an example of her one-page profile. I strongly recommend you Google Helen, Sanderson and Associates. They're a UK-based organization. Their website, Personalising Education, has really priceless resources for helping us figure out how to understand what's most important about our students so that we can engage them and really become familiar with them. And after we did that review process, some of the comments that Maggie's classmates made were that before she just got to play, but now she has to do her work. And the kids were actually kind of horrified that now she even has homework. They never meant for it to go that far. They felt that before, Maggie wasn't expected to do real work, that you had to finish your real work before you could go over and work with Maggie. And that once we went through the review process and figured out what was very important to Maggie, one of the things that's very important to her is that she be allowed to walk around, see what each student is working on, and then come back to her own desk and verify that her work is substantially similar to what her classmates is. And so she does that. Now the impression of her classmates is that they actually do work together. The impression of her classmates is by better including her, what they feel from the adults now is actually a much stronger sense of trust in Maggie, that they give her more space, that she has more autonomy, that she has more freedom in the classroom, and as a result, she's actually far better behaved and more motivated. Helen Sanderson Associates has this just really incredible planning tool called Presence to Contribution that just really helps us think about inclusion. And they talk about kind of creating a roadmap to get from simply being physically present to actually being a contributing member of the society that you're in. So being physically present for one of our kids means you're simply in the classroom. Your placement provides that you spend X number of minutes or hours in the regular classroom. Having presence is a step closer to actually contributing. It means that you're not just there, but you're actually observing instruction. If all the kids are sitting in circles, so are you. If all the kids are sitting at desks, so are you. You're noticed, you're visible. Actively participating is that one next step. So you're participating, you're being read to, you're listening to the same story, you're writing, you are expected to participate in some way to do substantially similar work to your classmates. Connecting means you're not just participating on your own, doing your own work, but you're actually doing the same kind of interactions with classmates that lead to that sense of belonging, the kind of interactions with classmates that happen in small group work, that happen around reading and writing, that sort of thing. So you're not just there, you're not just doing the work, but you're actually interacting with the other people there. And contributing is sort of the holy grail. This is what we're really working on with inclusion, is that knowledge that you are making your classroom better in some way because you're in it. For our kids with Angelman, there are just so many barriers. So, for example, a barrier to being present, to even getting on that first step to the road to contribution, is that so many of our kids have been removed from the general education classroom, or they have a placement in the general education classroom, but they're constantly being separated from it, or always being taken for, body breaks, that kind of thing. I have been in many of our kids' classrooms and seen how often our student with Angelman has a separate program. So the classroom teacher gets up and is giving instructions and is calling all the children to sit in the circle or to come listen to instructions for what the next activity is. And the paraprofessional or a special educator or a therapist is saying, no, pay attention, listen to me, your place is over here, not over there. And I don't think they actually ever realize they're doing this, but they're telling the student, the classroom teacher isn't really your teacher. You're not really part of that group. You actually have something separate over here. And it's not surprising that by the time our kids are a bit older, grade 3, grade 4, we start hearing that they ignore the classroom teacher. They only pay attention to their paraprofessional. They don't seem engaged in their classroom instruction. Well, most often we have actually taught them that. We've separated them from the classroom for so many times. In the middle of a lesson, we've just taken them out to do some kind of pull-out or some kind of extra work, and then we've just brought them back in halfway through something else. And we don't even seem to acknowledge that they've just missed all this instruction. We just expect them to sort of passively accept that there will be instruction that happens. They may only get bits and pieces of it, but they're somehow supposed to make sense of it and still feel like they belong in the class and still feel like that classroom teacher is their teacher. I think this is something that as adults we really need to pay attention to, that it's not just about the value that we might be able to find in some kind of pull-out service, but what happens to our child's program as a result of creating all these extra transitions and as a result of consistently removing them from general instruction. And at what point do our kids just simply check out and assume that that instruction doesn't even apply anymore if they've been removed from it so many times? A huge, huge barrier to just being present and beginning to participate is that our kids usually don't have oral language, and if it hasn't been problem solved by the IEP team, if we haven't really figured out a communication system, then they'll never be able to participate because they simply can't say anything. I mean, we really have to figure out that access to language piece, and we'll talk about that more in the webinar on communication support. So many of our kids' classmates aren't at all familiar with how our student communicates or how their communication system works, and so there's just that barrier, but we can really invite peers in to be part of it. And kind of a major barrier is just our own attitudes, just wrapping our head around how do we creatively figure out how to support our kids and engage them and create the expectation that they're going to participate. Let's see, so literacy is the essential work of school in my mind if we're going to really understand our student as a learner, if we're going to actually include our student, we have to believe that they're working on their literacy instruction. And you'll see that in the next webinar, how to better include them in literacy instruction. But to me, what it came down to with Maggie was that the reason she wasn't being included as well as she could have been was that we didn't imagine she was potentially literate, and therefore we weren't providing the same by presuming that she wasn't potentially illiterate, we were actually excluding her from a huge part of the instruction that happened in our classroom. It isn't inclusion if we're not including our students in instruction, so we'll be talking about that in terms of how we include them communicatively, how we include them with instruction. We need to notice if our students can't participate in what we're asking all the students to do. When we say, for example, all right, everyone, we're all going to sing, we have to notice that our student with Angelman isn't singing. Otherwise, we're accidentally sending the message to that student, everyone is expected to participate except for you. You're just supposed to sit there silently. I have watched so many of our children sitting in inclusive classrooms as these instructions are being given that they can't possibly follow, and just the growing anxiety that you'll see in some kids, where it's like the more aware they become of instruction, the more aware they become of what's expected of all the students, the more anxious they become about what it is that they can't even do. So we have to problem solve that. We have to notice it, and then we have to provide a means for our students to participate. So one of the easiest, one of the simplest, and by no means the best, is to say, all right, everyone, we're all going to sing. Maggie, you can't sing with the voice from your mouth, so how can you sing? Well, you can sing with the voice in your head, and what we can do is by tomorrow try to have recorded this song so that you can sing using the speech device that you have. So you can sing using a recording, but we need to notice it and problem solve it and invite the kids to help us do that. And I'm just going to escape this view of my slides really quick because I can't figure out why. Where's some of my slides? Oh, there they are. Okay, they're coming up. We developed what we call Maggie's 50-year literacy plan. When I was asking how Maggie could be included in the literacy instruction in her classroom, was I realized that obviously the school team found it very daunting that they were supposed to somehow teach Maggie how to read. So I said, let's think of it as a 50-year plan. Maggie's in school for 12 years. What is the 50-year plan to teach her how to read? And you're only responsible for the first 12 years. We'll pick it up after when she's done from school as her post-secondary instruction. And everything we've read about, everything I've learned about emergent literacy is that the worst case scenario, what should be the worst case scenario of how we teach Maggie in the inclusive classroom is that we have taught her how to love books and to derive joy from sharing her experiences with others. And if that's as much as she accomplishes during her 12 years in school, then that is a victory. I'm just going to skip this. I'm not sure how that's liking it. We have to figure out how to help our kids access physical presence in their classroom. So that means having an inclusive classroom placement. They have to simply be there. We need to provide their extra services as push in rather than pull out. And especially we need to make sure that they're in the class during the literacy instruction. And I know that will seem challenging to many teachers, but as we delve more into what our kids need in terms of literacy instruction, it's really the things that our general educators are already doing. We can do things like video record instruction, so that if a student is going to miss something for some unavoidable reason, if they're going to miss whatever the explanation is, let's find out if our student responds to a video of that instruction. A certain proportion of our kids are highly motivated by video, and they will happily watch video of familiar people. So we can say to them, you need to leave to go do this other work, but don't worry, we're recording it for you so that you can watch it when you come back. And we can observe the child and see if that makes a difference, see if they show some anticipation of watching their video, and see if they begin to show appreciation that we're actually noticing and trying to problem solve their absence from the classroom. So that's how we begin to overcome the barrier to being physically present. We need to figure out what the barriers are to our kids being present. Remember, that's the stage of being physically in the classroom, doing sort of physically what the other kids are doing, such as if all the children are in a circle, then making sure that our kids are in a circle. We need to make sure that we're providing some instructions to our student with Angelman that they can follow. So for example, if the classroom teacher is saying, okay, it's time for all of us to come do this activity, the paraprofessional, the therapist, whoever is with our student with Angelman needs to say, okay, let's go, and interrupt their own work and go do that, to make sure that we're not accidentally teaching the student with Angelman that you're not really expected to have presence in this activity. As teachers, there's a tool called looking for a universally accessible response. Karen Erickson talks a lot about this. Figuring out how our student with Angelman can respond to something, or any of our students with significant disabilities, and then figuring out how to make that a universal response method. So if our child with Angelman can nod, if they can point, if they can look, if they can reach, if they can look just in a certain direction, then we say, all right, everyone, rather than raise your hand, rather than calling out, look this way if you agree with this position. Nod your heads as you're reading aloud with the voice in your head, that kind of stuff. Starting to figure out how to give instructions to the whole class that our child with Angelman can also follow. Many of our kids with Angelman really struggle to organize their vision to be able to, for example, sit at a desk and watch a teacher on the other side of the room do something. But so often, if we can support them better, such as maybe video recording the teacher or magnifying the teacher, some of our kids will watch things. All we have to do is pick up an iPad, mount it, or aim it at the teacher with the camera roll on, and they'll avidly watch their teacher doing something that they actually couldn't organize their vision to do without looking at it through the iPad, because something like an iPad camera roll can just help sort of filter out all that extraneous visual information that our kids often find very difficult to filter, and it allows them to better observe their teacher. We can provide really hands-on materials. So for example, if there's a big calendar that all the kids are looking at, if there's a written text that all the kids are reading out loud, we can put a copy of it right in front of our student with Angelman, so they've got something, they've got visuals that are much more in hand. And just provide as many visual supports and auditory feedback as we can to our kids. So for example, many of our children do much better if their general educator wears something like a voice amplification system, so that many of you who have kids with Angelman will relate to this, of every tiny sound in the classroom, every tiny sound in the hallway, our child with Angelman just seems to immediately alert to, and is constantly swiveling around to see who's entering the class or what's going on outside. And this is really a function of struggling to filter out auditory information, It's a struggle to figure out what are the sounds I really need to attend to versus what are the sounds I should be able to ignore. And so if we enhance our auditory feedback, if we provide our kids with more visuals, such as while the teacher is talking, maybe the paraprofessional writes down key words about what the teacher is saying, or writes sort of graphic symbols to represent what the teacher is saying. When the paraprofessional is really helping to support our child's attention on the teacher, if the teacher is wearing something like a voice amplification system, it helps sort of drown out those extraneous sounds, and we can just really support our kids. We need to figure out how to support our kids to actually reach that stage of participating. So for example, supplementing classroom materials rather than substituting them with something completely different. I know it's extremely important to Maggie and to many of our kids to have the same worksheet in front of them, the same textbook in front of them. They've learned over time that they're different, and they want to look as similar as possible. So we might add to that worksheet. We might have magnified that worksheet. We might have chosen just one part of the worksheet that we're going to actually try to do with our child with Angelman. Maybe we're not going to try to do the whole thing, but we're going to add to it rather than so that they have the same materials that their classmates have as well as something in addition, rather than something completely different. We need to make sure that our IEP teams are providing our kids with a robust communication system, and that means, you know, a lot more than having some laminated photos. It means being able to participate. We'll talk in the communication webinar about research being done to figure out, for example, if a child only has access to 40 words, what are the 40 words that best allow them to participate in the regular classroom, and how do we give our kids access to those words and many others. We need to make sure that we're providing really explicit instruction. So, you know, for example, if I'm a teacher in front of the class and I tell all the kids to stand up and jump, if I have a student in a wheelchair, I would probably notice that. I would probably be saying, oh, and, you know, Maggie, you're sitting in your wheelchair. Here's how you can do this jumping activity too. Maybe you're going to jump by nodding your head. Whatever it is, we just have to make sure that when our child can't participate, that we're providing instructions that tell them how they can. I find our kids with Angelman really need explicit instruction for the purpose of why they're participating. So Maggie, you are listening to this chapter so that you can tell us who is your favorite character. Maggie, get ready so that when it's your turn, you can tell us about your favorite animal or what you did over the weekend. And if Maggie is distracted by something else and the teacher is reading something, the paraprofessional or her support staff redirects her to say, Maggie, don't forget, you're listening because you're going to tell us who your favorite character is. Whatever the broad activity that's happening in the classroom, we need to give explicit instruction to our student with Angelman about exactly how it is that the purpose of what they're listening to, so that they can better stay on track. And this really follows from a lot of the reading comprehension research with students with significant disabilities that Karen Erickson's working on. And we'll just provide accessible instructions. As we're reading something out loud, we're going to say to our child with Angelman, you're going to read this with the voice in your head. And afterwards, we're going to see if we can figure out how you could read this with your communication system. I need you to point to where you're reading. Now, maybe our child with Angelman is still learning that there is such a thing as reading, that there's such a thing as words on the page. We're going to give them instructions that tell them, it is essential that you participate, and here's how. You can start pointing to where you're reading. Guess what? This whole thing we're doing in the classroom called reading is something that applies to you, and I expect your participation. I'm going to show you, I'm going to model for you how I can point to where I'm reading so that you understand that that's what we're all doing. I'm going to ask you to nod your head with each word so that I know you're starting to think with the voice in your head. Our child with Angelman probably isn't yet. They may not be. They may have not developed that internal language yet. They may have not begun to try to read words internally with the internal voice in their head. But we can still provide them instructions to tell them that that's the expectation, and we can model how they would do that. We need to problem solve how our kids can access that stage of being able to connect with their classmates. So for example, they need to have access to things like remnant books and personal experience stories. This is where you really need the family to be involved to help you with this. So a remnant book is simply a homemade book with remnants of the things the child has been involved in. And we'll talk about, I've got some examples of that in the next, part 2 of this webinar, because it's often some of the first books that our kids get excited about. If they went to the movies, then maybe we have a movie ticket and a photo of some kind of promotional photo about what the movie was. But so that they have these remnant books, remnants and photos and stories to share with other people all all the things that they're doing so that they connect with their classmates. You know, imagine if your child does hippotherapy, if they have a homemade book to bring in with pictures of how they're horseback riding so that they connect with their classmates. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. We need to make sure that when we're teaching our kids, we're making that really direct, explicit connection with what they already know. So if we are studying animals and we're first going to review with our student with Angelman what they know about animals. Well, we know they know about horses because they ride horses, and we know they know about cats because they have a cat at home, and we know they know about dogs because we had a dog come into the classroom a few weeks ago. Remember when we studied seeing eye dogs? Now let's take what we know about animals, about those animals, and let's grow it as we study this next topic. But we just need to be really intentional about connecting with what they already know. And again, that's where we really need families to be involved, because so much of what the child knows about is things that happen outside of school. So we need to give families that opportunity. I was just in England, and there was a teacher there who sent home a whole questionnaire at the beginning of every school year. Tell me about all the animals that your child has in their life. Tell me about all the places that your child has been to, so that while she was teaching, she could draw on that knowledge. We need to do things like create a communication circle. We'll talk about that more in the communication webinar, but that's just where we teach peers about our child's communication system so that they can actually model it and try to use it in the classroom. We're going to associate learning with what our student already knows and cares about. So for example, the letter A is just a totally random configuration of 3 straight lines. I mean, it's really not a very exciting abstract concept, but we can teach our kids with Angelman about the letter A if we teach them to associate it with their best friend Alex, or their brother Andrew, or their favorite snack, which is applesauce, etc. So we just have to really be making things very, very tangible. And we need to help our kids learn what it is to actually contribute to their classroom and not just be receiving services. So for example, making sure that peers have the opportunity to explore their communication system and their technology, whatever assistive technology our student has, and use it in the classroom. If a classmate has to write a paragraph and they're not doing a very good job with adjectives, it's not a very rich piece, we might say, check Maggie's Proloquo to go. You know, that folder she has of describing words might give you some ideas of how you could really jazz up your writing. We think about ways that we can recruit peer supports who will really benefit from supporting our student with Angelman. So for example, if we have a student in class who's really struggling with their confidence over reading aloud, well, we might ask them to read aloud to our student with Angelman. If we've got a student who's really trying to improve their reading fluency, then that's the student who should read to our student with Angelman, rather than at reading time have the paraprofessional read to the student with Angelman. I mean, paraprofessional probably doesn't need to develop her reading fluency, but chances are we do have some students who do. And so when we pair the kids who need to work with our kids with our student with Angelman, then we start providing a way that our child is actually creating an opportunity to enhance the learning of other kids. As teachers, we can really explicitly acknowledge all the ways that our student with Angelman is contributing just in terms of their personal attributes. You know, their curiosity, their engagement. You know, our kids with Angelman are often unusually just positive and cheerful. Our kids with Angelman tend to be very honest and authentic in their reactions to things. We can value that. We can name it. We can use it as an example for their classmates. Sometimes our kids with Angelman come to class and they've been seizing. They've been struggling. They've had, you know, a variety of challenges. It might be scoliosis. It might be with their mobility. And we can really acknowledge that and name it and use it as an example with their classmates, because we know that every kid who goes to school with one of our children is going to have to deal with something one day that they never would have chosen, that they would rather they never had to deal with. Something is going to happen to them that they wish hadn't have happened to them. And they can start preparing for that early by realizing that this happens to all kinds of people, and sometimes it happens to people quite young. And maybe we don't get to choose what happens, but we get to choose how to deal with it. When I look at kids with Angelman, with all the challenges they face, I so often see kids who are choosing to find the positive, who are choosing to focus on what they can do, who are really choosing a very positive way of dealing with some really hard situations. And I think we need to name that and focus on that. When in doubt, we need to ask the classmates, ask the peers, because when we're including a student with Angelman in the classroom, it is an opportunity to teach all of the students about human diversity and what it means. It's an opportunity to teach all the students about the meaning of help and support, and that's kind of the last point I'm going to make. It's an opportunity to involve all of the children in problem solving, to just simply say to the kids, wow, we're going to sing this song. Does anyone have an idea of how Maggie can sing along? It is amazing to me how often the kids raise their hands and come up with solutions that as adults we just weren't creative enough to even come up with. So put it to the kids. Ask them for their help, because what we're doing is we're sending the message that we so value the participation of the child with Angelman, that we are willing to all be part of the problem solving to allow that participation to happen. So when our student is included, we're always asking who actually needs to provide support to them. Is there a peer? Is there a struggling or disengaged student who, if they can work with our child with Angelman, can actually enhance their own level of engagement? Before we default to having an educational assistant support our kid, let's ask who could actually really benefit from it. For example, so many of our children with Angelman have an iPad that they're doing a bunch of their schoolwork with. And there's always another child in class who is struggling or disengaged. Maybe they're an English language learner, and they actually become much more engaged if they can work with our child with Angelman using that same assistive technology. What we need to focus on is not creating traditional peer helpers, because the way that we so often set up peer helpers in the classroom is that it's this charity. We help those who are less fortunate because it's the right thing to do. Once you finish your work, you can come over here and you can help Maggie. But what we're saying is really that help is very one-sided, that support isn't something that we reciprocate. There's the helpers and there's the helpees, and never the twain shall meet. And so often we're accidentally sending the message that the student with Angelman is the work, not the we do our work together. Classmates are learning about concepts about kindness and charity, but they're not really learning more about that. And when in doubt, just watch what happens with our peer helper situation and just see how often is the helper being praised for helping someone. How often is the person receiving help being praised for graciously receiving it? Usually not. And yet, usually the person who has to actually receive help is not receiving any kind of praise or recognition for that. And yet, all of us have probably experienced a time when something happened to us where we couldn't do for ourselves what we could usually do, and we had to rely on the help of someone else, and we probably didn't feel very appreciative or grateful about it. We probably didn't feel very gracious about receiving it. I had a situation where I injured both my wrists with a repetitive strain injury, and I couldn't use my hands. And it was one of the most difficult times of my life in terms of just this feeling of anger, of having to rely completely on other people and try to figure out how to direct the support that I needed, rather than just sit there trying to be appreciative of whatever help people would give me. I mean, it's a really, really difficult situation often to receive help that we wish we didn't need. So we can address that. We can start teaching people that receiving help is natural. Receiving help is something we're all going to have to do. And here's how we figure out how to get help on our own terms. With traditional peer helper situations, we often are accidentally reinforcing stereotypes that people with disabilities are just perpetually needy. And if we're not careful, we're going to create a situation where we think of help as the way that our society still does, right? I mean, we know that people fear the idea that one day we'll have to rely on others to help us, that one day we'll be vulnerable. And we can actually start looking at, as we include our students with Angelman in the regular classroom, we can actually look at that as how do we start to change that fear. And one way we can do that is by creating really authentic peer supports where we say, we help every student because we expect every student to do their best. Every student can expect that they will receive help, and that receiving help is simply what we do because we so value the participation of every person in class that we will provide whatever assistance every person needs in order to participate. When we create these more reciprocal helping situations, these peer support situations, then we actually start laying the foundation for friendship. We show that we help each other because we're all doing the same work, and we can actually share the tools that we learn. We're teaching our students how to be engaged in the problem solving that makes inclusion successful. We're looking at the student with Angelman and actually seeing them as an opportunity because the student with Angelman needs support in the regular classroom. They need someone who understands the system that they're trying to learn to communicate and can support them to do it. And they often need physical assistance. They need verbal prompts. We can see that as an opportunity to involve other students, to provide a role for other students, and actually to teach other students about the value of being able to receive support. We live in a society that fears needing help, that fears being vulnerable. There was a survey done here in Canada looking at if we legalized assisted suicide, who would actually take advantage of that? Who wishes that they had the option for assisted suicide? And we found that the #1 group that feels that they would want to have the option of assisted suicide is actually elderly women. Elderly women, mothers, grandmothers, truly believe, there's a huge number of them who truly believe that if they reach the point where someone needs to be supporting them to get dressed, to take them to the washroom, to feed them, if their own daughter has to help them with that level of care, that their own daughter is actually better off if her mother is dead than if her mother is providing her the support that she needs. If we have any doubt about what our society believes about receiving help, we can look to what our grandmothers believe about their own need for support. That's the kind of society we live in. We live in a society that believes that if we become vulnerable and need help, that we might actually be better off dead, or the people around us might be better off dead. When we are including our student with Angelman in a regular classroom, we can choose to teach a different curriculum. We can choose to teach a different belief. We can choose to teach that every single person simply requires the support they need to participate because we so value that in all of our kids, so that all of those kids who've been included with ours can go through the regular classroom, can go through and receive the support they need. And I think that's my last one. Let me just check. Hold on. Okay, we can skip through that. And what we're now going to move on to in a few minutes is literacy instruction in the inclusive classroom.
Thanks, Erin. All right, we want to just give everybody a quick break so they can, go get a drink of water, use the washroom if you need to. Like I said before, if you registered for both sessions, you need to log on to the next one. So we will be joining you shortly. Thank you.